Hi, Kathy here. We're just about to dive into a quarter-long study of art history, Renaissance to modern. And before we do, I'd like to start off by dropping back a bit to discuss a few basic questions. Why art? Why art history? Why the Renaissance? Why art? Humans have been making and valuing objects and images deliberately created as an expression of skill or imagination apparently for at least 37,000 years. It seems to be something we just do. No one knows why humans created the cave paintings at Chauvet in what is now France, which are among the oldest artworks that we know of. Although there are lots of theories, some say that the Paleolithic painters who created these and similar images made them to help with their hunting, to make a living, in other words. And perhaps the same idea motivates some artists even today. Though for every painting that sells for $110 million, as Jean-Michel Basquiat's Untitled did a few years ago, there are probably 110 million artists who haven't made a very good living at all out of art. As we look at visual art in this class, you'll be seeing many images and works of visual form that were made, at least on one level, as perhaps acts of worship, like these sculptures from Chartres Cathedral, as historical record or propaganda, like the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius's victory column, with his victories represented in a spiral frieze going up hundreds of feet, as civic political symbols, like Michelangelo's famous sculpture of young David the giant slayer, or family status symbols like this Botticelli Madonna, for which he took the wealthy matriarch of the Medici family as his model for the Blessed Mother, and her son Lorenzo, later to be known as the Magnificent, is handing her the ink pot down there in the lower left. Certainly many of the art objects that we'll see were created as goods whose beauty gave them an economic value that the artist certainly hoped would allow him to make a living. And it usually was a him in much of the work that we'll be studying. In many cases, all these motives and more may be mixed together. Let's not forget, though, that there are other ways for humans to achieve any of those ends. It could be argued that hunters would be better off spending their time sharpening their arrowheads or practicing their marksmanship if more effective hunting was really all they had in mind. I have to think that the painter of these images took, is joy too strong a word? Satisfaction, at least, in creating them and in the knowledge that others would see them. And I even wonder if the Paleolithic artist or artists thought of someone like me or you, viewers who would see these images long, almost unimaginably long after they were dead. It happens. Just ask Marcel Gravideau, whose dog disappeared into a hole on a walk one day. In rescuing the dog, he discovered that cave at Lascaux where those paintings and many others were found. My point is, images don't get made if there's no one to see them. In other words, artists mean their works to communicate, on some level, with someone else, their friends, their gods, their customers, even unknown viewers to come, perhaps. As we look at images together in this class, you may be struck, I hope you will be struck, by the enormous energy that humans have put into creating visual images and form. Visual communication seems to be a behavior so basic to the human spirit that every culture that has found durable materials to work in has left us their art, even if they have left us little else. But even if you agree with me here, if you grant me the importance of art, why study art history? When you pick up a newspaper or look at the news, art doesn't always seem very important, maybe not the obvious subject of a historical study. Economic factors, power dynamics, allocation of resources, political systems, war making, peacekeeping. When you pick up a newspaper, all these things can seem a lot more important than art. In this class, though, we'll be looking from a different perspective, a longer perspective that spans centuries and even millennia. From our perspective, wealth, trade, military exploits, gender roles, politics will all be examined in the light of the difference they make to art. It will be the art that matters. And this is a fair perspective, I believe, since in large part it has been the art that remains from the cultures that have gone before ours. We call this perspective art history. There's a much quoted first line from a novel by L.P. Hartley. The past is a foreign country. And yes, it is a foreign country. We don't speak the language. And even when we put in the effort to learn the language of the past, we can't unlearn our own viewpoint in the present. It's clear that we can't look at any ancient work of art and see it as its maker meant his or her contemporaries to see it. We don't know enough, and at the same time, we know too much. Of course, many artists haven't worked only for their contemporaries. The Pantheon is still standing in Rome after almost 2,000 years, or take the Belvedere torso, rediscovered in Rome at some point in the 1400s, already an ancient work when it was found. I think the imagination capable of producing the Pantheon or the Belvedere torso was capable of imagining me or you, a 21st century viewer. I mentioned these two works of art because I just saw them recently, and they looked good. Why shouldn't they look as good to a 30th century viewer? If our world keeps spinning and if humans keep looking at art, as I hope we will. That brings me to my last question for this video. Why the Renaissance? Well, we humans do keep looking back at each other's art from cultures that went before. We keep asking, how'd they do that? Why'd they do that? What did they know that we may have forgotten? These are the very questions that lit the spark of the Renaissance, and that spark happened to fall into ground that was already kind of smoldering. The artists, sculptors, and architects of the region we now know as Central Italy were inspired by old Roman architecture and some new archaeological findings of old Roman sculpture like the Belvedere torso or the Laocoon, which I'm showing you again, or the Pantheon. But here's the thing that really gives me chills. Those Roman works were themselves inspired by older Greek art and architecture that the enterprising Romans liked and copied or simply stole when they conquered Greece. The time scales we're talking here are very hard for us living in a 250-year-old nation to imagine. Rome grew and thrived for something like 1,200 years. And when it subsumed Greek art, that art was already ancient. You've heard of the fall of Rome. It makes it sound like it happened over a weekend. Rome took centuries to fall. And the artists of the Renaissance weren't by any means the first to rediscover Rome. Throughout the long medieval millennium, about 1,000 years between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance, politicians, writers, artists repeatedly looked to Rome for inspiration on which to model their laws, their buildings, and their art. We call this impulse classicism, and we'll be looking at it much closer very soon. The ruins of Rome's art and architecture could be seen all over Europe and the Mediterranean, but nowhere was it so accessible and so close to the surface as in central Italy, the former heart of the Roman Empire. We'll also see that the Italians of the Quattrocento, the 1400s, when the Renaissance really heated up, had timing on their side. And as we look soon more closely at the historical context, we'll see that military and economic factors kind of fanned the flames in central Italy. Its geographical features also conspired to make the Renaissance explode with vitality in that particular time and place. So to study the Italian Renaissance is to study a very special moment in an unusual geographical region where layers and layers of human culture have reflected on each other's work over deep time and asked those questions. How'd they do that? Why'd they do that? What did they know that we've forgotten? Sometimes it's technology. How'd they do that? Because remember, the time spans are going to be wildly big here. Plenty of time for things to be invented and forgotten. When the Florentines went to build their Duomo, their cathedral, they wanted a dome as big and spherical and apparently, to the eye, unsupported as the one on the Pantheon, created 1400 years earlier and still standing in Rome. But no one knew how to do that. We'll see how Brunelleschi figured it out when we get to the Quattrocento in a few weeks. There it is. And it still looks good too. Sometimes it's technique. How did they pose their models? How did they learn about the musculature of the human body? Why aren't we observing nature directly anymore? How can we move forward? By looking back. The Renaissance is quite essential, I think, to an understanding of the Western art that comes after it, and it's also key to help us make sense of the 2 or so millennia that preceded it. This is not to say that there are no other regions of the world where cultures have similarly deeply layered reflections on the past, and we will look at other cultures to give context to our study. But I do want to justify in some way the time we'll take, the time art historians love to take, on the Renaissance. Much of what we'll be looking at in the 500-year span covered in this class will either be the roots, achievements, or what you might call the legacy of the Renaissance, including reactions to it and contrasts to it in later times and other cultures. I hope that gives a little introduction to some basic questions that you might have as we embark on this exploration together. I'm looking forward to working with you and hearing your thoughts about the art we'll be enjoying together this quarter.